presentation.
Right. Okay,
yes.
well, thanks very much, Susie, and hi, everyone.
Thank you.
So I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint. I was just going to read sections of my paper, but actually I changed my mind at the last minute, and I've just rushed out a PowerPoint presentation, which may or may not help. But I'll share my screen and
absolutely, as you feel better.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. You need to enable me to do that. It's not really essential if you don't want to, but
screen photos. Oh dear. It would be easy if my computer works. Less easy with this, because I know that there is the green button screen, maybe. No. Can you request it by any chance? Do you see any button in which you can request?
If I click on share screen, it just says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, it's not helping.
Does anyone know how to fix that?
Meetings, recording security, chat, and minimize meetings. Yeah, because I'm using the phone since my computer didn't connect well.
Don't worry about it. As I said, it's not an essential visual thing anyway. I just thought it might be helpful to have some of the words on the screen. But
Alex first maybe can help us. If you have an answer, Alex, just tell us. I saw you raising your hand.
Please make sure that you include both the LinkedIn library.
No.
Anyway, don't worry about it. I'll just get cracking.
Thank you, Jack. I'm so sorry. I'm so
that's
sorry.
Okay. That's okay. What I will do is I'll just put the full title of the paper and my email address in the chat, just so that you've all got that if you need it. Please, anyone, especially students, please feel free to drop me a line at any point if you want some clarifications or want to talk about any of the things that I bring up in the paper. So yeah, as Susie said, this is a chapter from this book which we published, well, Susie edited and was published on Springer earlier this year, called Phenomenology of Bioethics, and I've got pride of place as the first chapter in the book. I'm sure not deserved, but I'm going to present to you a condensed
fully
version.
Deserved.
Thank you. A condensed version of that paper, but a little bit about me first. My name's Jack Griffiths. I am an associate lecturer in actually in the politics department at the University of Exeter in the UK, where I am at the moment. We have had some sunshine today, but it seems to have gone cloudy again now. And so good afternoon, but I imagine for most of you, good morning is more appropriate, and well done for making it to an 8 AM online seminar. That's quite impressive. What did I say? I work in the politics department, but I'm a philosopher, really. We have quite a diverse community in politics at Exeter. And the thing I'm particularly most interested in all of my work, really, is the relationship between how we conceptualize the natural world, in particular the world of biology, the living world, and how we think about questions of ethics, politics, and society. So if you like, this age-old distinction between world of facts and the world of values, but particularly focusing on biological understanding, whether that comes from science or from popular culture or from wherever. I'm interested in our conceptualizations of the living world, organisms and their parts and processes, and how that informs how we think about ethical questions and political questions, but also is informed by those as well. It's a two-way relationship. So that could include political ideologies, for example, are interestingly bound up with the history of interpretation of the natural world. Anyway, that's what I'm particularly interested in. And it's taken me in a number of different directions. Some of my work is influenced by the tradition of phenomenology, in particular hermeneutics, which I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. Susie, briefly, your students here, this is a bioethics course, is it,
Yes.
rather than a phenomenology course? So we're
absolutely. So hermeneutics, maybe saying a few words to explain. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, it's good to know what the context is here. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'll say a little bit about those big scary words, phenomenology and hermeneutics, but actually probably for my main argument, it's not going to be that important. But I'll get cracking. So probably the best way to introduce you to the argument of the paper is to outline two, sorry, I'm just bringing up my slides here so I can see them at least, is to summarize the kind of two main aims of what I'm talking about in the paper, because there's a kind of number of parallel arguments going on really, but they can be condensed into two main things. Firstly is to do with the relationship between bioethics and the philosophical world of phenomenology. Hence the title of the book, Phenomenology of Bioethics. I think in the original call that Susie sent out, the invitation was something like, it was calling for papers on answering the question, what can phenomenology do for bioethics? I think it was something like that. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, phenomenology roughly is the study of first-person experience of the world. So what is it like to experience or to understand something as an object of our experience in the world? A lot of people have done work on phenomenological approaches to bioethics, and most of the contributions to this question have focused on an examination of the experiential world of the medical patient. So that is the object of medical treatment or technological intervention, biomedical technological intervention. They might be interested in, for example, what is the experience of the patient in the context of a clinical setting, for example. And then we use that to enrich our understanding of health and illness and other concepts that help us answer bioethical questions. So I'm not disparaging that approach at all. There's lots of really interesting and really important work that's been done in that way. But the paper that I've published in this book starts from a different point of view. Instead of the world of the medical patient, what I'm starting from is the experiential world of what I call the bioethical subject. So instead of the object of an intervention, the bioethical subject is quite literally the person engaged in bioethical deliberation. So I mean, all of you doing a bioethics course this term are bioethical subjects. You are people engaged in deliberating morally about bioethical questions. I don't know how you define bioethics over there, Susie, but I have a very broad definition here, just meaning something like the moral deliberation about intervention on living bodies. So any practice or action or intervention on a living thing, whether human or otherwise, can be a topic for bioethical deliberation. So instead of the medical world of the object of medicine, we're entering the experiential, did I say medical world? Instead of the experiential world of the object of intervention, we're entering the experiential world of anyone engaging in moral deliberation about bioethics. So this is where hermeneutics comes in. Hermeneutics is, briefly put, this the study of interpretation. And the kind of background that I'm influenced by here is an area of phenomenology that focuses on the concept of interpretation. And basically, the hermeneutic phenomenology begins from the assumption that all experience of the world, of any object, of anything that you encounter in the world, is insofar as you understand it in some way and you make sense of it, that experience is shaped by a process of interpretation. That is the way we understand things is not simply given to us by the thing in the world. It's not determined purely by that thing in the world. It is partly determined by the way we come at it, basically, the way we encounter it, and the kind of conceptual frameworks that we use to make sense of that thing we're encountering. So yeah, when I'm talking about the hermeneutic world of bioethics here, I mean the set of frameworks of interpretation that people bring to the table when they think about bioethics. And there's all sorts of things we might be interpreting here. I'm going to get onto that in a moment. So I'm going to focus on some particular objects of interpretation. At a general level, we can take a hermeneutic/phenomenological approach to moral philosophy or any kind of moral dialogue. And what that would be, I think, in my view at least, is to recognize that any moral judgment, any value judgment, any ethical deliberation, we can only really understand it if we understand the context of concepts and what Gadamer would call the horizons of meaning or horizons of significance within which that person is thinking in that way. You shouldn't abstract from that context a particular moral judgment, for example, and try and critique it or understand it sort of abstracted from that context. You have to put yourself in the world of the person doing the moral deliberation in order to understand what they think, why they judge in a particular way. And so that's the general view, and I'm applying it to bioethics here, and I'm going to dig down into some particular relationships which I think are important. So that's the first aim of the paper, a particular way of understanding what the study of phenomenology, brackets, particularly hermeneutics, can bring to bear on bioethics. The second main aim of the paper is to present an argument about the relationship between bioethics and biology, that is, biological science, the theoretical and empirical study of living things, things that are alive. And the argument is briefly that the descriptive claims of biological science, claims which appear to be purely empirical descriptive claims, actually help to shape these frameworks of interpretation that we use in bioethics. And this actually, I argue, can have substantive consequences for moral judgments. So this is an argument that is trying to break down a certain cliched popular view that there is a clear separation between scientific description and value judgment, and that never the two shall meet. You know, that there's the job of scientists, which is making just descriptions of the world, and then there's the job of bioethicists, which is making judgments, value judgments about what is right and wrong. One of the aims of my argument here is to try and break down that separation a little bit, because I think that's oversimplified. To give you a little bit more detail about the overarching argument here, the language and imagery and models and metaphors, everything that constitutes the kind of discourse of modern biological science, which are, as it happens, interpretations of biological phenomena, living things in the world. All of this language and imagery, it privileges certain assumptions about what I call the ontology of life, to give you another of the categories from the title of the paper. And by that I mean simply the way we conceptualize what life is, the being of life, the kind of existing thing that living beings are, and also the kind of thing that maybe some particular parts of those living things are as well. So language of science privileges certain kind of ontologies, ways of understanding the being of life. And bioethical judgments, the kind of judgments you guys are going to be trying to make this semester with Susie about what is right and wrong and good and bad in bio interventions on living things. Those judgments can themselves depend upon the kind of ontological assumptions you have. Quite simply put, we judge actions differently depending on what we think the object of that action, what kind of thing we think it is. And I'm going to give you a detailed illustration of this in a moment by way of a sort of case study. A case study in what I'm calling the hermeneutics of biology, to refer to another element of the title. That is the study of the interpretive resources that biology gives us and the implications of those resources. Okay, so I've got a number of different audiences here as well. Biologists interested in phenomenology and vice versa, but also bioethicists, communicators of science, philosophers of biology, anyone who, if you buy my argument, should be aware of these kind of hidden and subtle relationships between elements of the way we think about things. And I think it's important to reveal this kind of background architecture of thinking that goes on in bioethics in order to avoid certain unjustified leaps of reasoning, shall we say. Okay. So I spent quite a lot of time on the kind of overall argument there, which I think is hopefully helpful, because I'm going to get into some detail now. Just to say something very briefly, another sort of additional aim to the paper is to synthesize and present the work of two scholars who I very much enjoy the work of, who are called Christophe Raymond Sutter and Jackie Leach Scully, and I'm just going to put their names in the chat as well, so you can look them up if you like. Much of what I'm going to argue, you will find similar arguments in their work, and I'm kind of synthesizing a lot of their recent papers and adding some of my own flavor as well, of course, but just to make sure I'm citing my sources properly. That's their names. And if you want further resources, drop me a line or look at the paper that I published. Okay, so let's get into the case study. Susie, I think I'm going to go slightly over time because we've took a while to get going, but I'll do this as quickly as I can. So a case study in the hermeneutics of biology. What I'm going to do for you here is present two different ways of understanding or interpreting what kind of thing the genome is. That is the collection of DNA in the cell nucleus of all living cells. There are two, well, there's one very dominant and there's one growing way of understanding what kind of thing that is, and on the ontology of the genome. And these are kind of in opposition to each other, and they have different implications for bioethical reasoning. So I'm just going to read some sections from the paper here now. So we all know that we have something called DNA inside of us, but ask most people what DNA is, and they're unlikely to give you an answer in terms of the material properties of the stuff, or even in most cases, the specific roles that it plays in bodily processes. More likely, they will say something apparently much more profound, such as it's the basis of life, or it's what makes you who you are, or a little more sophisticated, perhaps, it contains the instructions for building an organism. Answers like these, which kind of give the genome some kind of ontological fundamentality, have been called by sociologists Nelkin and Lindy the mystique of DNA in contemporary culture. I'm going to characterize this way of understanding the genome in terms of what I call genetic essentialism. That's a key term for you to remember there, genetic essentialism. Now, firstly, get rid of the genetic. What is essentialism? What do I mean by essentialism here? It's the view that living beings are composite entities. They're entities made up of two basic things. The first is their essence, and the second is their appearance. Now, the essence of an organism is a kind of inner, unobservable level of its being. It is fixed, it's independent of the organism's development and its concrete existence, and it defines the organism's true form, its true nature. It's a kind of underlying design for the organism. The appearance, on the other hand, refers to the external, material, changeable aspect of the being. So all of us, according to this view, have an essence, which is our inner core, and we have an appearance, which is this kind of contingent material outer appearance, the way we appear in the world. And the appearance is subordinate to the essence. It's something that's merely an expression of essence or a manifestation of it. Now, importantly, implicit in this view, this dualism, is a set of normative structures, that is, ideas about rightness and wrongness, basically, in a very broad sense. You could say that this dualism has a normative logic within it. And that is that the essence is something which is meant to be realized. To take an analogy, think about the design of a car, for example, or the set of instructions you might get with a piece of furniture that you have to put together yourself. These things exist for the sake of their own concrete enactment. That is because they're the products of intentionality. They come from an intention. Intentions themselves are things which aim at their own fulfillment. So they contain this, what we might call teleological normative structure. They ought to be fulfilled. That is the nub of the essentialist idea, and why it has implications for normative thinking, for moral thinking, in my view. Okay, I'll skip a lot of the detail here. That's a very ancient and widespread way of thinking, basically. A particular version of it is genetic essentialism, which is essentially the identification of this essence with the entity of the genome, the collection of DNA in a cell nucleus. We all have billions of little genomes in our cells. This is the idea, made up of DNA. And if you are a genetic essentialist, you in some sense understand that to be an underlying level of reality of the organism, which defines the proper form of the organism and directs its development towards that form. This has been the dominant interpretation of the genome for most of the 20th century and and more recently, but there's a lot of challenges to it. We can summarize this genetic essentialism notion by calling it the program conception of the genome. You're probably all familiar with various metaphors that come from computer science primarily, talking about the genome as a program. We have a genetic program inside of us, or a code, or a set of information or instructions. These are all sort of intentional and semantic notions that are used as part of the descriptive language of biological science to describe a thing in the world, an object, the genome. Okay. So, and it's a powerfully intuitive view of life. It's not, it's not crazy. It helps us make a lot of sense of a range of different things: reproduction, heredity, development, evolution, all sorts of different areas. It simplifies a lot of complexity, but there's also a growing challenge to it based on a lot of empirical research, which emphasizes a number of things. For example, the multifunctionality of genetic structures, that they function in different ways in different contexts, the plasticity of organic development. Organisms can change and shape themselves in reaction to the environment in complex ways, and also the organism's active interaction with that environment is also increasingly being shown to be very important in both development and evolution. And I'm not going to make a whole argument for why we should reject the program conception, although I think we should as a side note, because that's not really my point here. I just want to flag that up as a whole other line of argument that we could pursue, which is the right interpretation of the genome, or the best interpretation of the genome. Instead, I'll present to you an alternative view, one which is increasingly prominent certainly in philosophy of biology and in various circles of what we might think of as more theoretical science as well. And we can call this developmental constructivism. I'm going to pop these terms in the chat again, because these are sort of big words that would be in the slides. So we're deep end into philosophy of biology at the moment. So this might be some stuff that not many of you have much background in, but this is all by way of a case study for my main argument that I outlined at the beginning. So the constructivist view presents a different idea. This doesn't deny that the genome as a material entity has unique characteristics that make it hugely important in particular organic processes, for example, protein synthesis, but it rejects the special ontological status that is awarded to the genome by the program conception, the essentialist view. Instead of a coded representation of instructions or essential information, DNA is here seen as simply a particular kind of material resource, something that is used and can be incorporated into the development of the organism in various flexible and context-sensitive ways. There are all sorts of other resources in this view as well, from cellular structures up to climate, to diet, to exercise, to culture, language, ecology, everything that might go into integrating the conditions for the development of an organism in particular. On this view, the meaning of any particular resource, the role that it has in creating the organism, is contingent on context, contingent of all the links between all the other resources, and no element of this developmental system, to use some of the language here, contains something like the plan or the design for the organism. There is in fact no such plan. Living things do not grow and develop according to a pre-given program or plan. This is the basic idea of constructivism, is just to reject that essentialist notion. So on this view, for any particular instance of organismic becoming, of development of an organism, precisely what or who it is that becomes depends on the ongoing constructive interaction between that being and the particular nexus of developmental resources. All these kind of different things that link together to produce the particular life of the particular organism we're interested in. Now, just to set aside one misunderstanding of this, this is not a blank slate view. This doesn't mean that life begins without any determination at all, and could be anything at all depending on the environmental influence. This is often opposed to a program or essentialist view, but actually this is a rejection of both of those ideas. Life is not a blank slate, but it also doesn't come pre-programmed for any particular outcome. In a real sense, life must be figured out afresh each time through a process that is more like improvisation than like production. So on my slides, I've got a picture of some cars being built in a factory. That's the production idea of development. And then I've got a picture of some guys playing jazz. That's the improvisation idea of development. So developmental constructivism, life is jazz, basically, is the main idea here, which we can all agree with, I'm sure. Okay, right. So what's the point of all of this? As I said, it's a case study. It's an illustration of the opposition between alternative sets of interpretations. We have to make a choice between these interpretations, which is the best way to describe the genome and its relationship with the organism and its development. So we have a choice of description here, and communicators of science have to make this choice all the time. So do philosophers of biology, so do bioethicists when they refer to the things in particular biomedical practices that they're talking about. If they're talking about genetic modification, for example, you are going to be making descriptive claims about what kind of thing the genome is. And there is a popular and perhaps cliched view, which I'm sure is certainly not universal, but it is probably mainstream, that we can do bioethics without having to really worry about what the best description is, because science just tells us that, right? We just know what the best, descriptive claims come from science, and then all we have to do is make the moral judgments. And my argument here is that science, like everything, like every other area of experience and understanding, is involved in interpretation. There is never a single given way of understanding the thing we're interested in. There might be better and worse interpretations based on a whole load of different things, but it's up to us to make the judgment about the interpretation first. And actually, the choice of description that we make can have implications for the moral judgments that we make. So they're all, these are interlinked things. To give you a brief illustration of how this can make a difference, let's take an example. So the concept of identity, human identity, individual identity, is a prominent theme in the ethical debate around human genetic modification. I would be very surprised if this is something you don't talk about with Susie in your bioethics course this semester. The rights and wrongs of intervening on genomes, say, for example, in fetuses or embryos, and the implications this has for the identity of the individual involved. This is a huge area of debate. The program conception, the essentialist view of the genome, has a particular implication about identity. And the idea is that when you were an embryo, I'm sure you will remember, there was a particular code of DNA in the nucleus of the cell that you were, and that in some sense determines your true core self. That doesn't change across life. That remains the same. On the outside, in your appearance, you might change in all sorts of ways, but you remain you precisely because of that particular code that remains the same across your life. This is a particular version of the genetic essentialism idea. There's a scientist called Walter Gilbert, who was one of the leaders of the Human Genome Project back in the 90s. And towards the beginning of the project, he famously claimed that by the end of it, we will be able to have, and I quote, 3 billion bases of sequence, that's genetic sequence, on a single compact disc, a CD. Most of you probably don't remember CDs anymore, but it's a way of storing information. And one will be able to pull a CD out of one's pocket and say, here is a human being, it's me. This is a polemical claim, of course, but it reveals an ontological assumption about the significance of the genome. It contains the identity of the individual. He will pull out the CD out of his pocket and say, look, it's me. This is essentially me in this information. So implications for a particular debate. This is another polemical example from the world of politics, but nonetheless tells us a lot about this way of thinking. This is a quote from a British politician called Jacob Rees-Mogg, who those of you in the States I'm sure will never have heard of, but he's quite a character over here. And he made an intervention in a debate a few years ago about a particular kind of genetic modification that was being debated. And I won't read the whole quote, but he says, if you alter any of the genetic components of an embryo, then this is a quote, you have done something very profound. I think it does affect the person in a very fundamental way, even if the number of genes affected is very, very small. And he says, it's not a cure for disease, it's the creation of a different person. The argument is that in modifying the genetic elements of an embryo, one is not simply altering its accidental properties, its appearance, its possible appearance. It doesn't just affect, for example, the chances of that individual getting ill later on in life, which is one of the main reasons we often do these kind of interventions. Instead, according to Jacob Rees-Mogg and many others who have slightly more sophisticated ways of making the argument. Instead of that, one is actually eliminating the individual altogether and creating a new one. So changing any part of the genetic code results in a numerical change of identity. This is my way of explaining this as an analogy. It's like getting a digit wrong when you dial someone's phone number. You know, if I get one number wrong when I call you, it makes as much difference to who I get as changing half of the numbers or all of them. Doesn't matter how many you change. As soon as you get the code wrong, you get a different person on the end of the line, or maybe no one at all. And this is the view of identity that comes with the genetic program concept. And for people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, this is quite literally the elimination of an individual. It is on a par with abortion for if you follow this argument. Some particular identity is being destroyed, even though the embryo as a kind of material whole is not being destroyed. Because of that particular change, it is no longer that individual anymore. It is now a different identity. So that kind of argument only makes sense if you accept genetic essentialism and the program concept of the genome. To developmental constructivism, the other view I presented to you, the relation between genetics and identity looks different. One's identity is not sort of fixed by a core genetic self. Perhaps it's something which develops across time and is contingent on your relationships with your environment, social and otherwise. Genes do not determine who you are, independent of this concrete and changing situation that you find yourself in. So on the constructivist view, the particular moral objection to human genetic editing that we just looked at ceases to make sense. Now, I'm not presenting this because I want to argue that genetic editing is great and we ought to do it. My view on that doesn't matter at the moment. All I'm doing is showing you that these two different ways of interpreting an object of biological science, of describing it, make a difference to the landscape in which we make bioethical judgments. If you're a constructivist, you might also disagree with genetic editing for other reasons. There might be other reasons to object to it, or you might approve of it for particular reasons. But even if we end up at the same moral conclusion, we'll have got there by a very different path. And that's really all I want to argue here. And the main point really is that this is often overlooked. As I've said a few times now, there's this idea that there is scientific facts and descriptions, and then we make the judgments. Actually, the two are much more closely interlinked. I'll finish with a quote from Christoph Raymond Sutter, one of the scholars I mentioned earlier, because he has a nice way of describing this. And so I think the takeaway message here is that when we're making choices about description in science, or descriptions of scientific objects such as genomes or organisms or ecosystems or whatever it is, these are in themselves partly ethical questions. I think they should be seen as questions about how we ought to relate ourselves to each other and to the living world beyond. So they have environmental and bioethical implications. Raymond Sutter says that a choice between theoretical descriptions of life is a choice between different kinds of relationship. To quote, a morally qualified relationship is established between describers and the beings they describe. Description is not merely a representational activity that can succeed or fail, be correct or misleading. Description is itself a form of relational practice, a form of being in the world, a practice of being present to those others that we describe. And I'll leave it there, I think. I've run over time a little bit, but thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jack. This was great. Plenty of important terms here: essentialism, descriptivism, interpretation. So I leave the questions to everyone who is here. I mean, if you have anything you want to ask about the presentation, I saw that Tiffany at some point asked if you could write down a name, but I don't know when she asked it, so I don't know which name she was referring to. So this could be a first question. And I don't know, if you want to ask questions, either write them in the chat and I will read them for you, or just take the floor and ask the question. Or I will break the ice if you want. While we're waiting for Tiffany to, okay, there is one question. See, the recording, I will share it both on our Blackboard page, and if Jack agrees, I will review the beginning of the, I mean, I will do a little editing and then upload it on YouTube, but only if you, of course, agree on that. Think about, sure, my pleasure. And yeah, I mean, okay, I will start from my brief consideration. What I really loved about his paper was to not take for granted anything that comes from biology and hard sciences in general. I mean,
Oh, we've lost you, Susie.
I'm sorry. In the sense that when I was, especially when I was teaching environmental ethics, you know, the notion of nature was necessarily motherly, good, productive, and without knowing it, we interiorize the number of descriptions that are living and constrains our way of creating meanings. While, yeah, in the meticulous work that Jack is doing in his paper, we break all these categories and we try to see, you know, how many meanings each category is capable of bringing in. So that was absolutely the value I saw in the paper. Especially, I don't know, in this class, we are going to discuss, for example, about IVF. And yeah, genetic editing is one of the problems that arises with IVF.
That quote from the British politician that I gave you was actually in the context of a debate about a kind of IVF treatment, mitochondrial replacement therapy, which you might talk about. It's essentially where I think it's a denucleated egg cell, so an egg cell with the nucleus taken out. A nucleus from the mother's cell is put into that, and in order to effectively replace the mitochondrial DNA. And for this reason, people call it three-parent IVF, because there is some kind of, there's biological material coming from three different people, essentially. That was the context for that.
Is that for like families who want like a surrogate or something? Like they can't do it themselves and they have like a third mother or something?
It's not a surrogate in the sense of someone else who gets pregnant for you, but it's a surrogate. Right. Someone will donate an egg cell, for example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But
That's
it's only
cool.
part of the egg cell that gets used. Yeah.
Right. All right. Thank you.
No worries. Anyway, thanks, Susie. I mean, the comments you were making there seem absolutely right to me. One of the takeaways here is exactly as you said, never, if I have a message for you when you're studying bioethics, don't take for granted that the way that scientists describe things is the only way of describing them. And yes. but that's not an anti-science message. You know, I'm not a you know, I study biology as a science, and it's actually someone who thinks that there is only ever one way of describing something in science is someone who's never studied science. Actually, all areas of science have controversial debates within them. It's only when you get in the realm of popular culture, there's this image of the scientist as someone who just kind of has the absolute truth. And so actually, yeah, firstly, never assume that there is only one possible way of describing something that you find in a scientific discussion. And secondly, be aware that the choices we make between different descriptions can, not always, but can, for example, as the way I've shown in the paper, further downstream have consequences for moral judgments that we make without us really realizing that that's what's going on. That's my argument, at least, anyway.
Yeah, it's appreciating science even more, because yeah, you don't take for granted, but it's phenomenological. I mean, according to phenomenology, science is a never-ending process for which you keep discovering and questioning at any time the phenomenon, and that is way more meaningful than taking for granted.
Excellent. And I'd also say that it's important to recognize that in the hermeneutic tradition, this is not supposed to leave us at a kind of relativist position where we can't make any judgments between different interpretations. So the view is not that any interpretation is as good as the next, because what interpretation is a dialogue between the interpreter and the object being interpreted. And there is such a thing as better and worse in that context. It's just a contextualized matter rather than a simple kind of objective correlation between description and object. So, you know, I would argue, moral implications aside, that the constructivist ontology of the genome and development is better. It is a better way of making sense of life than the program conception. Now, for the sake of the argument I gave you, that doesn't matter what I think about that. But as an aside, it's possible, even though I'm a hermeneutist in this context, that I think it's a matter of interpretation. I think we still can make judgments about better and worse interpretation in that context. So it's not that, well, anything a scientist says can be anything. You know, there is space to grab hold of the argument here.
Beautifully put. Thanks. Here we have Lillian who asked a question. What core principles or persons from phenomenology or hermeneutics would you suggest bioethics programs take up to inform future bioethicists? Which is the core of the book I tried to put together. How does one introduce this instability, destabilization in sciences into syllabi? That's a great question.
Well, yeah, I'm sure Susie will have plenty of suggestions for you throughout the semester in answers to both of those questions. But I mean, just to drop a couple of names, I mean, the main influences of my hermeneutic approach to this stuff is Hans-Jörg Gadamer, Gadamer, who is a German phenomenologist, philosopher from the 20th century. I think he died about 20 years ago, but he was writing for a huge amount of time, sort of 70, 80 years or something. And he was in turn influenced by Martin Heidegger, who you've probably heard of, some of you. So those, I mean, that's really for a basic understanding of what hermeneutics is. I don't think you'll find much in Heidegger that will directly inform your thinking in bioethics, although Gadamer actually did publish some work on bioethics in the 90s, I think, called The Enigma of Health. I'll put that in the chat as well, which in certain ways brings together a number of the themes that I've been talking about today as well. But it's more about the concept of health and illness from a subjective point of view.
Thank you. I liked also, I don't know if you read her work, Kay Toombs. I really like the way in which she defined illness. I mean, she's not so focused as you are in this talk on biology, more only on the concept of illness. But I really like the way in which she used phenomenology. And yeah, this essay of Gadamer, that's right. Yeah.
And also the two scholars I mentioned, Christoph Remensutter and Jackie Leach Scully, Christoph is a Swiss bioethicist. Jackie is from the UK and works in bioethics and disability studies. Yeah, as I said, either get a copy of the book that Susie published or my chapter, or drop me an email and I can send you references if you're really interested in this. They've published both together and separately a series of papers and chapters over the last 20 years or so, which I'm kind of drawing together in this paper a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Anyone? None of you digesting words and concepts? All right. Anyway, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, for this wonderful presentation today. I think it was a great way to break the ice with all the concepts and problems involved in a bioethics thought through phenomenological lenses. I still apologize for all the technical problems I had today. I'm so sorry. But it was wonderful to have you here. And if any of you have questions for Jack and you want to ask me, I will ask him, or yeah, we'll find a way.
I put my email address at the start there. I'll put it in the chat again so you can
thank you so
copy
much.
that there if you like.
Thanks. Thanks for taking the time this evening for you, this late afternoon.
No worries. Thanks
and,
for having me.
Have a good day. Have a good day, all of you. Take care. And there will be an upcoming webinar, I think, next week. Cool. You have the calendar on Blackboard, I think. All right. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Cheers.